Hello, everyone. My name is Edward Schumacher Matos. I'm the director of the Edward R. Murrow Center for a Digital World at the Fletcher School. It's a graduate school of international relations at Tufts University. The Murrow Center, which focuses on issues of private media and of public diplomacy by governments, has been doing a project on what the incoming U.S. President Joe Biden should do to rebuild U.S. image and influence, or soft power, in the world. We've been speaking with wise women and wise men around the world as they represent the audience. What is it that they think the new administration should do? So today, we turn to the view from Latin America. And we're very fortunate to have with us one of the wisest persons in the region, Jorge Castañeda. As a former journalist for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, I have known Jorge for years. He is a former Secretary of Foreign Affairs of Mexico, author of more than a dozen books, a contributor to the Times and other media outlets in the US and Latin America, a professor at NYU, and he owns his PhD in economic history from the Sorbonne. But I think he's also been secretly channeling the Murrow Center, if you want to know the truth, because I was delighted to discover that he has just published a new book that speaks directly to our project. And let me hold it up here. It is titled America Through Foreign Eyes, and I can't recommend it more highly. Jorge follows in the tradition of Tocqueville and so many other leading global intellectuals to critique the US model of government, and US regional foreign policy with fresh but very informed foreign eyes, and with really, if I may say so, but I'll let Jorge say this for himself, I love for the United States in wanting to help it. He doesn't come at it from a negative point of view, but with a very, very, very critical eye on certain things. It's also great reading, which I'm sure you'll understand why after listening to Jorge this morning. So with that, let me begin. I'm going to interview Jorge for about 25, 30 minutes and then turn it over to your questions. Please submit them via chat box or via the message box. A Fletcher student who works with me at the Murrow Center, Archie Schmital, is going to collect your questions and read them to Jorge. So you'll be able to participate in this. We've scheduled an hour. Jorge's been kind enough to say he'll go a few minutes longer if the discussion merits it and you want him to stay, and we'll do that. So let's begin. Jorge, so many of our other discussions concerning US influence in other regions of the world have had to deal with competition with China and with Russia, but Latin America is different, right? What is the status of US influence and of its support for the democratic model in Latin America after its decline in much of the rest of the world in recent years?
Well, Ed, first of all, thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity to chat with people who were following us on the webinar. And it's great to be back in touch with you. It has been a great number of years. It's wonderful to be back in contact. On the issue of U.S. influence in Latin America, and you mentioned China and Russia, I think it's important to stress the difference between the type of influence that perhaps, let's say, China may have today in Latin America and the type of influence that the United States will continue to have, and in my opinion, should continue to have. You mentioned soft power, and I think this is one of the biggest differences that I stress in my book, America Through Foreign Eyes, between the US and China today as great powers. In Latin America, the United States is obviously present and has been present for 200 years now, in military terms, in political, ideological terms, and many other ways. But today, perhaps more importantly than ever before, through what I call American civilization, Joe Nye started calling it soft power, which was a wonderful term that he coined many years ago. The US is present through fashion, Hollywood, literature, architecture, art, the language, obviously, English, technology, everything else. China is present in Latin America, much more present than it was 20 or 30 years ago, but essentially China is simply a market for Latin American commodities, at least for now. There are some Chinese investments in parts of South America, but they are all linked to commodities. A highway here, a larger port there, a bridge on the highway to the port, some other place. But essentially, China is not involved with any kind of real soft power in Latin America, much less political or ideological influence. The United States is, perhaps not in the best way the last 4 years, but I'm hoping that in the future, certain American values can once again come to the fore in American soft power in Latin America.
So if you were advising President Biden or incoming President Biden, soon to be President Biden, what would you recommend that he does in terms of any major shifts in focus towards Latin America?
Well, I think the first one would be, and this is something that is in his platform. You can see it at joebiden.com. Indirectly through the call for a conference of democracies. I think the first point is that Biden should, and his people should, once again, and much more obviously than Trump, but even more than President Obama, much more along the lines of what Jimmy Carter did now 40 years ago, emphasize the defense of human rights in Latin America. That the United States should be a force for the defense of human rights in Latin America, and that it should be a force also for the collective defense of democracy in Latin America through instruments such as the OAS, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission and Court, the Inter-American Democratic Charter that was signed on 9/11, precisely in Lima, Peru. This is the first thing that I think a Biden administration should do. It should not pandy to autocrats in the region like Trump did with autocrats elsewhere and some autocrats in Latin America. But on the contrary, it should be very forceful and explicit in defending human rights and democracy. But I'd also like to mention, Ed, very quickly, what it shouldn't do. And what I don't think it should do is this nonsense about a change in tone, about listening to Latin America, about not bullying Latin America. Now, Trump did not bully Latin America. On the contrary, he placated people like Bolsonaro, like Bukele, like Duque in Colombia. He was nice to his friends. He didn't bully them. He even was very nice to López Obrador in Mexico, who for other reasons would have been an adversary. And certainly this business of listening and respect, all these are bromides that are largely meaningless and generally become a way of a substitute for actual policy. So I hope he doesn't fall into that trap and actually gets into the nuts and bolts of the relationship.
So has the democratic model, and American foreign policy supposedly doesn't push just the American way of doing democracy, right? I mean, but it tries to push the broader democratic values, and each country will select its own particular models. We know there are many various models for democracy, but in these last 4 years, has the democratic model inside Latin America been damaged by President Trump's approach to the region and approach to the world?
Well, damaged is maybe going a bit too far, but there are cases in Latin America where clearly the human rights and or democracy situation has deteriorated, and where the Trump administration has not or was not a force for defending them. The two most obvious cases, I think, are Brazil and El Salvador. Not to say that the situation in Cuba or Nicaragua or Venezuela is a positive one, but Trump wasn't particularly nice to them. On the contrary, he was a bit nasty, at least to the Cubans and even to the Venezuelans, but that would have been expected, I suppose. But the other part is more complicated, because in the case of El Salvador and the case of Brazil, the Trump administration really looked the other way on a growing sense of deterioration of the human rights situation in these two countries, and threats to democratic constitutional rule in both of them. So I think, rather than focus on countries or get into name calling or finger pointing, I think it's a question of a broad defense of human rights and democracy in the region, and then apply it to each country as the situation evolves.
And in general, do you see the trend for human rights and democracy? Do you see it more or less static for the last few years, or do you see it going up or down, and something we have to be concerned about? Not just the countries you mentioned, but Peru and Bolivia and many other places.
I think there have been, there are threats. There is an authoritarian drift in Mexico, certainly. For example, President López Obrador doesn't like the media in the same way that Donald Trump doesn't like the media. The difference, of course, is that the media in Mexico are much weaker. Civil society is much weaker. Institutions are much weaker in Mexico than in the United States. A similar situation exists, obviously, in other countries. Peru has had 4 presidents now in 5 years. That's not good for anybody. There is an institutional weakening there. The situation in Venezuela, of course, has continued to deteriorate. Trump wasn't able to find a solution. There is no easy one, because you have a tremendous humanitarian crisis that no one can ignore. But on the other hand, trying to overthrow Maduro by force and from outside Venezuela has never been a good idea in Venezuela or anywhere in Latin America. So it's not an easy situation, but I am worried about this authoritarian drift in many places in Latin America. And I think it's important for the US to be a force for the defense of human rights and democracy.
Mm-hmm. Well, even among Hispanics in this country, some people were surprised by the percentage of votes that Trump got from the U.S. Hispanic community. I wasn't particularly surprised by it, but the argument is that there is, and I don't think it just is something unique to Latino culture. I think it's globally. A lot of people just like that sort of personality that he has of being forceful, being very masculine. That kind of alpha male personality appears to a lot of perhaps alpha males everywhere around the world. Is that Latin American culture? Is that something that's part of that appeal? Is it a sort of a psychological masculine tough guy appeal that has it done, or is it there's something more fundamental in trends in Latin America we should be concerned about?
Well, I think you have presidents today in Latin America who have use the same type of reasoning and the same type of towards power and towards society that Trump does.
Yes.
The best examples, of course, are Bolsonaro and Bukele in El Salvador. Right. But I would also add probably López Obrador in Mexico, even though he comes at it from a different ideological vantage point. The main issue here is, I'm not so sure it's a sort of Latin or Latino admiration for the macho culture, but I think there is, both in the United States and in Latin America and many countries, a certain frustration with democratic rule, with a strong civil society, in the sense that many people believe that crime, for example, or corruption or violence in general are unwanted byproducts of democracy, and democracy has not been able to address these challenges. I don't think they're byproducts. I think they're a reflection of very difficult issues in these societies, which would be present with or without democracy, with or without an iron hand. But a lot of people feel that way. And I imagine some did in the United States. I would just beg perhaps to differ for a second, Edward, on Latinos and how they voted. I think that all Latinos, with one exception, voted overwhelmingly for Biden, nearly 3-1, according to most of the exit polls.
You're right.
The exception, of course, are the Cuban Americans in Miami-Dade County mainly, and some in across the river, but mainly in Miami-Dade. And I think that's perfectly understandable. The Cubans continue to believe that no one should be friendly to the Castro regime, and President-elect Biden was President Obama's vice president, and President Obama went to Havana The Cubans don't like that. The Cubans in Cuba liked it. The Cubans in Miami didn't like it, and that was to be expected. And you pay a price at the ballot box. President Obama always said elections have consequences. Foreign policy has consequences in elections.
Right. No, I agree with you. I agree with you. So what about you've written about the Che Guevara, you've written about the left in Latin America. What is the status of that in Latin America? Is there still, there are still Americans who think, oh, we should be concerned about communism in Latin America or something like that? What is the status on the left side? Is there something that the new Biden administration should be concerned about?
Well, not concerned. I think, you have some progressive governments in Latin America today. They're not necessarily the type of progressive governments that I would prefer, and that many of which we had in the early 21st century in Chile, in Uruguay, with Lula in Brazil, perhaps a couple of other places. Mm-hmm. We have progressive governments today in Argentina, in Mexico, in Nicaragua. I don't even want to label Maduro in Venezuela as progressive or not progressive. He's just a simple, incompetent dictator, period, and a corrupt one, by the way, also. But there are these other governments, who are all democratically elected, that are so far, with this authoritarian drift I mentioned in Mexico, respectful of fundamental democratic norms. I don't think there's anything for the Biden administration to worry about in these cases because of their being progressive or left of center, or whatever you want to call them. In that sense, I think that the Biden administration's attitude towards them should be pretty much what Clinton, Bush, and Obama's stance towards the so-called pink tide in Latin America, which began back in 1999, should be. Basically get along with them, and as long as fundamental U.S. geopolitical interests aren't threatened, just try and have the best possible relationship with them. If they want to do things that American or the American government doesn't think is very reasonable in terms of domestic issues for them, that's their problem. They want to spend a lot of money they don't have, that's their problem. If they want to stop paying their debts, that's their problem, as long as no fundamental interests are harmed on the part of the United States. And I think, by the way, that all of these governments, if you go back, as you were mentioning, Edward, let's say the first 20 years of this century, the large majority of the left of center governments in Latin America that we've had have pursued very orthodox economic policies. I don't want to call them neoliberal, but they sure look a lot like that. And none of them have really been anti-American in any way. Again, except for Venezuela, right, Nicaragua, and not even Nicaragua. Daniel Ortega gets along very well with the United States and very well with the American ambassador in Managua. It's no longer at all the 1970s or 80s, I think.
Well, Cuba so often has been the poster child for U.S. Latin American differences. What is the influence of Cuba today in Latin America and the Cuban model? And you mentioned, Obama going to Cuba. Should Biden pick up on that? And if the United States wants to continue to reinforce its influence in Latin America, what do you think the U.S. should do about Cuba?
Well, on Cuban influence, I don't think it's significant anywhere in Latin America except as sort of nostalgia and folklore. People like Cuban revolutionary songs, and they have pictures of Che Guevara and stuff, but it doesn't go much further than that, except in Venezuela, where the 20, 30, 40,000 Cuban officials that are there, many of them are doctors, many of them are sports instructors, many are teachers, and many of them are security and intelligence personnel, and many of them are all of the above. They play an enormous role in keeping the Maduro regime in power. Without them, Maduro would probably have been overthrown at some point by the military. So their influence is enormous. Elsewhere, it's not. What should Biden do? I think he should, as at some point former Secretary of State Kerry said in an interview when he was speaking on Biden's behalf to Andres Oppenheimer, about a couple of months ago. He said, that the U.S. was a bit, or that Biden and Kerry were a bit disappointed in the results of the Obama normalization in terms of human rights and economic reform. I think that Biden should try to re-normalize, to return to the Obama status quo ante, but to sort of ask the Cubans or try to convince the Cubans that this time around they have to go a little further on human rights issues. They have to go a little further on economic reform. And they also have to cooperate with the rest of Latin America and the United States and the Western Europeans in finding a solution to the Venezuelan humanitarian crisis. That, Venezuela should be on the table, on the agenda between the US and Cuba, not in terms of the Cubans betraying their Venezuelan comrades or anything like that, but in terms of Cuba playing a constructive, positive role in finding a solution to a terrible humanitarian crisis. 5 million people, 1/6 of the population having fled Venezuela is no minor affair. We hadn't seen anything like that in Latin America for decades, if ever, by the way.
Right. Well, U.S. public diplomacy in Latin America includes a radio TV marquee, which is aimed at Cuba, and it's supposedly designed to, originally it was meant to be like the Voice of America, just sort of, try to distribute straight news into Cuba. But under the Trump administration, there's been a move to try to make it more more propagandistic, shall we say, and more aimed against the Cuban government, as well as against the Nicaraguan and Venezuelan governments. Is that a wise thing to continue doing, or should, do you think the new administration should change its efforts and how it reaches out to Cuban people and deals with, public diplomacy?
I don't think that those sorts of things are really either useful or necessary. I know a lot of people in Cuba watch or listen to Radio Marti or watch TV Marti, more the radio than television. But I'm sure there are other ways to do this. For example, in the case of Cuba, it's not so much, it's not as simple perhaps in Venezuela or Nicaragua. Just to have American Spanish language networks, be more easily received in or tuned into in Cuba. You don't need anything more than Univision or Telemundo for people in Cuba to watch and get the news. They get the news about the world, about the United States, about Cuba, about everything else. These are two very professional, very serious networks with very serious news people working there. And sometimes they'll be very critical of Cuba, and sometimes they won't even bother with Cuba. I think that would be a wiser way of having U.S. soft diplomacy, soft power present in Cuba through the news, rather than this abrasive and somewhat hostile instrument that Radio and TV Marti have become, or always were. They didn't become, they always were that.
And so, I mean, would you more broadly even say for the Voice of America and Latin America that perhaps the U.S. government's wasting its time and just leave it to Univision and
well, Voice of America
and let it go at that?
Well, Voice of America is a different sort of thing. First of all, they're much more professional.
Right.
The professional news organization. Sometimes it is a bit propagandistic, but you and I and our colleagues have been interviewed or spoken on VOA over the years. I don't see it, as more of an instrument of propaganda than similar state-owned media elsewhere in the world, whether the BBC is perhaps a little more independent, but the VOA has been independent depending on the administration. The same is true for other networks from other countries. I don't see the VOA exactly the same way. I think it's useful in many countries, especially transmissions in Spanish, etc. I wouldn't do away with that, but be careful to keep its autonomy intact. I think that's something that Trump people obviously didn't do, and that the Biden people should do.
Right, that's a big fight in Washington right now. Let me throw you a curveball. Talking about Cuba. Pardon me?
A hanging curve.
Hanging curveball. Okay. as the U.S. gets into more and more of a tiff with China over the South China Sea and everything in the Eastern Pacific and the Southern Pacific and so forth. And China keeps expanding into the South China Sea, a little bit like the United States did, into the Caribbean back in the 19th and early part of the 20th century. Jimmy Carter gave back the Panama Canal, right? But the United States still sits in Guantanamo. Should the United States give Guantanamo back to Cuba at some point? And would that be an example for the rest of the world to see?
Well, I think that you're right, Edward, in that this is an issue. And I'm not referring, as many people mistakenly did with Obama, and I know you're not referring to the prison in Guantanamo where different people are held, accused of terrorism, etc. We're referring to the naval base in Guantanamo. Right. And I think with time, it's an anachronism. In other words, it should disappear. Puerto Rico is a different story because it's the United States. But other than that, than Vieques, I think, there are no naval bases or military bases anywhere in American military bases anywhere in Latin America. There was a sort of DEA base in Manta in Ecuador that was shut down, I think, 10 years. And it's hard to see exactly what purpose Guantanamo serves. On the other hand, it's also true that the Cubans have lived with Guantanamo now for a little more than 100 years, if I'm not mistaken. And I guess that they can live with it for a little more. I think at some point, Cuba has to stop being an exception in Latin America, for Latin America, and for the United States. The United States should have relations with Cuba and Cuba with the United States the way everybody else does. Now that means that has a lot of implications for the United States, but it also has them for Cuba. At the end of the day, Cuba is one of the major examples of American non-exceptionalism, as I mentioned in my book, America Through Foreign Eyes, because of the war, which Americans call the Spanish-American War of 1899, because of the Platt Amendment, because of the virtual protectorate that it was after the Platt Amendment was repealed, because of the US policy in the Cold War, the Bay of Pigs, et cetera. For all of those reasons, Cuba has been a clear example of how when the United States wants to act like a traditional empire, it does, and it can. I think it's time to end that, but both sides are going to have to make major concessions, because the Cubans also have to accept that they can no longer be an exception in Latin America. They have to be like other places. They have to have elections. They have to have political parties. They have to have a human rights commission. They have to accept foreign scrutiny of all their stuff. They have to allow people to come and go as they want. All of the things that the Cubans don't allow, if they want to stop being an exception, they're going to have to allow. If they don't want to stop being an exception, then they shouldn't ask the Americans to stop being exceptional with them.
That sounds very wise. So let's turn to some of the other subjects in your book. The greatest source of soft power, shall we say, is the example that the United States itself presents on its own domestic policies. And Joe Biden has said that himself in some of his speeches, And you point out a number of policies that don't help the United States and Latin America. And they may not be the wisest thing for the United States. In particular, we're talking about now issues surrounding drugs and immigration, for example. So on drug policy, what would you suggest to the new Biden administration on what it should do? And what impact would that have in terms of Latin America and U.S. policy in Latin America?
Well, on drugs, in my book, in the chapter on drugs, I try to address this issue through the notions of hypocrisy and pragmatism. Americans are tremendously hypocritical on drugs, but they're also very pragmatic. Right. That has been a good solution for the U.S., a terrible solution for everybody else in the world, and particular for Latin America, because what it leads to is for the US to try and pursue its war on drugs beyond its borders without really pursuing it within its borders, which is fine, by the way. I think it would be terrible for the US to wage a war on drugs in the US. I'm not one of these Latin Americans who say, you have to do something about demand and all the drugs you consume in the United States. No, what you have to do about the drugs you consume in the United States is legalize them. And then people will decide if they want to consume them or not. And the illegal nature and the extraordinary rents that come from that illegal nature of drugs in the US will little by little disappear. You know, some people will consume drugs, some people will not. Some will manage to live a normal life doing so, some will not. But all of that will be the US's business one way or the other, period. In the case of the Biden administration, I think the first thing to do is to recognize that the war on drugs in Latin America has failed miserably. It's been waged now, we will soon be coming up in 2021 to the 50th anniversary of President Nixon launching the war on drugs in 1971. The results are terrible. The volume of drugs entering the United States has not changed. The type of drug has changed. The volume has not. The number of consumers in the United States has not gone down. It's the type of drug that people consume that has changed. The prices of drugs have not gone up, reducing demand that way. Even if that were ever going to happen, it didn't. And in contrast, in Latin America, you have violence, you have human rights violations, you have corruption, you have gangs, you have the works. So the first thing is to acknowledge that this didn't work. It's a complete failure. Second, begin to do what Biden and Vice President-elect Harris have already said. Move in the direction, at least in the case of marijuana, of decriminalization or legalization, following so many states in the United States that have already done so. And begin to seriously look at what Oregon just approved 3 weeks ago, which is the full decriminalization of all drugs. Again, with a little bit of hypocrisy. It's legal to own, to possess, and to consume, but not to buy or sell. So how in the world do you get drugs if you don't buy them or sell them, and you don't want to have a poppy plantation in your garden? Because you can grow a habit marijuana plant in your home, that's easy. It's much more difficult to plant coca leaf or poppy on your balcony.
So another very contentious issue is immigration, right? It's contentious inside the United States with real ramifications for Latin America. What there, and this of course has a special effect on Mexico as our neighbor. And once upon a time, Mexico was the great, supplier of immigrants coming into the United States. In more recent years, it's really turned to three small countries in the Northern Triangle of Central America, right? And all the caravans coming up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the great issue that's had inside the United States. But we understand the issues that presents for those countries too. So how do you see that the issue of immigration, how the United States treats immigrants in the country, and U.S. immigration policy? What would you recommend for the Biden administration there, thinking of both American needs, but also Latin American needs and American influence in the region?
Well, again, Edward, I tried to approach this issue in my book, America Through Foreign Eyes, through the notions of hypocrisy and pragmatism, like with drugs. Americans are very hypocritical about immigration, but they're also very pragmatic. Hypocritical because going back 150 years, Americans have loved to decry the last wave of immigrants, either because they're Catholic or they're brown or they're Asian or they're they play soccer or they eat spicy food. And at the same time, Americans have, of course, accepted with much more hospitality than other countries, waves of immigrants going back to the 1840s. I think today the situation is complicated because although the United States has today probably a higher percentage, around 15%, 14 to 15% of foreign-born individuals in U.S. territory, the highest since the late teens of the 20th century or the early 20s. At the same time, the forces at work in the US and in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean driving immigration are as present and as powerful as ever. This nonsense that I've heard about immigration from Mexico drying up, migration from Mexico drying up because of the economic improvement in Mexico over the last 20 years, but nobody's seen that economic improvement, much less the people who migrate to the United States, the people who got to New York last night. So that's silly, and especially silly for the Northern Triangle countries. So what can Biden do? Well, the first thing I think to do is what he said, to eliminate, to roll back all of the terribly nasty, mean, petty, horrendous measures and decrees that Trump imposed regarding family separation, regarding eliminating any kind of asylum, forcing Mexico, blackmailing Mexico into doing its dirty work for the US by forcing it to accept that people requesting asylum in the United States wait on the Mexican side of the border, and forcing Mexico to deploy its army on our southern border to stop the immigrants from entering Mexico. To begin with, roll all of that back. Secondly, what he said he wants to do, trying to get Congress to approve some kind of immigration reform that will allow for a path to citizenship for the 11 to 12 million people in the US without papers. Revisit the DACA or Dreamer issue and try and get that done to eliminate this limbo they've been in since Obama created a path also to citizenship for them. And also try and seriously increase the number of visas, H-2A and H-2B visas, either through Congress or unilaterally. It has been done. Trump has done it for agricultural work and also for services work. Why? Because the US economy, especially if it recovers quickly and moves on, as I hope it will under Biden, continues to need low skill, low wage labor from Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. It's not that Americans want these jobs. They don't, for whatever reason. It's not for me to judge whether they're right or wrong. I ask my students all the time. Every year I ask them, would you guys like to wash dishes in a restaurant in New York over the summer with no air conditioning for $7 an hour? They say no. How about 10? No. How about 15? A couple of them say, yeah, okay. How about 20? We'll do it. You're really going to pay somebody $20 an hour to wash dishes in a restaurant in New York? How much are you going to pay the waiter? How much are you going to pay the chef? How much are you going to pay the maitre d' or the hostess? Are we really going to pay twice as much to have dinner, Edward, you and I, in a New York restaurant? Can't do that. So let more people in. If you don't want to create a temporary worker program explicitly, just increase the number of visas and find a way to have H-2As and H-2Bs over time begin to enter a permanent residence situation if they want to. Most will not, by the way. I don't want to say it's my situation, but it's not unsimilar, obviously, from a very different point of view. I've been coming to the United States to teach now at NYU for nearly 20 years, and I don't want to stay the whole year. I want to do exactly what I do, teach one semester here and go back the rest of the time to Mexico and hang out. That's what I want to do.
So you're our 21st century Tocqueville here, looking at the United States in your book. How would you then handle the poor working class whites, if I can say it that way, as a shorthand, who resent all these foreigners coming into the country and who see them as economic competition in keeping wages low? How would you address that? What would be your advice to the American government and the new administration?
I mean, I think the first thing is obvious. I don't have really much to add to what everyone has said about this, and the Biden people have been very eloquent on this. Stop appealing to the worst sentiments or instincts of any society, and the American people are no different than others in that sense. Don't appeal to the worst, appeal to the better angels. Look at the communities in places like Ohio and Iowa and Nebraska, where there never used to be any immigrants from Latin America, and where the last 20 or 30 years there have been. And initially there was a very negative, hostile, racist, nativist reaction. And little by little, the communities began to coexist. And little by little, they got to understand and know each other. And little by little, Americans who had never seen a soccer ball in their life, or had never tasted spicy Mexican food in their life, all of a sudden said, hey, these guys work hard. These guys are very family oriented. These guys respect the law, pay their taxes, are serious people, and they're fun besides, so we can get along. Yeah, we like, we go nuts over football. They go nuts over soccer. That's okay. On the contrary, we can maybe even find something to work together on as far as sports is concerned. Anyway, I think that's the first thing to do. And the second one is to improve the lot of white, male, over 50, 55 Americans who have suffered a great deal over the past 25, 30 years because of the trends of growing inequality in the United States, globalization, losing jobs. All of that is true. It's always important to remember there are many more poor white people in the United States than there are poor African American or poor Latinos. The proportion is greater among Blacks and Latinos, of course, but the absolute numbers are enormous. And this has been going on for 40 years now, since 1980, and got much worse after the year 2000. Well, I think policies centered on building or rebuilding an American welfare state and attending to the needs and aspirations of these people will help everybody in the United States, and will tone down the feelings, the sentiments that led 70 million Americans to vote for Donald Trump.
Well, I mean, we could go on and on about this, but I know there's a lot of questions that our audience has, so I don't want to monopolize all of your time. Archie, you want to step in here?
Yeah, firstly, thank you so much, Dr. Casienda. That was amazing. And I mean, it was such a dense and insightful discussion. You covered everything from China to Venezuela, immigration and drugs. So I'm looking forward to read your book. So thanks a lot for that.
I hope you
I will, I'm sure. So we have a lot of questions. So I'm going to try to cover as many questions as possible. So the first one is from Kelechi Kalu. The US government has historically collaborated with multinational firms in Latin America and sometimes at odds with them. To what extent can the Biden administration defend human rights and champion democracy in Latin America without alienating the business interests?
Well, it's always a difficult challenge, I think, Archie. It's in the sense that you have many American multinationals and Canadian ones and German ones and Chinese ones. I mean, it's not an exception. In regions like Latin America or in Africa or in Asia that do not respect basic norms that they do respect or they are forced to respect in their own countries. This is true for labor rights. It is true for environmental issues. It is true for issues like child labor. All of these are real problems. Now, increasingly, the United States has signed trade agreements with countries in Latin America, and actually the Obama administration negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, with many Asian and Latin American countries that Trump pulled out of, that include a series of important provisions dealing with labor rights, the environment, climate change, child labor, et cetera. They don't have as many human rights and democracy clauses as the European Union agreements have. I think it's a pity that the Canadians, for example, didn't push hard enough in the NAFTA renegotiation to include human rights and democracy issues and gender rights in the new USMCA. The Canadians originally said they would, and they basically backed down. They got cold feet when Trump said no. It's a pity, but that doesn't mean that a Biden administration can't be much more forceful on what there is in these provisions, in these treaties with Mexico, with Colombia, with Central America and the Dominican Republic, with Peru, particularly on the environment. They can do a great deal if they want to. So yes, there's a challenge and there's a tension, but it's a tension that can be addressed like some countries in Europe, not all, have been addressing for some time now.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much for that answer. The next question is from Francisco Ortigo. Do you see a Latin American front emerging? Example, with the AMLO in Mexico, Bolsonaro and Evo Morales and allies, that fundamentally changes its posture towards the US, from one of subjugation or cooperation to one of confrontation?
Well, no, I don't, first of all, because the heads of state that are mentioned in the question have certainly walked back or have not attempted any kind of confrontation. López Obrador in Mexico or AMLO, as on the contrary, as I said, accepted to do the United States dirty work on migration as a result of American blackmail. Bolsonaro has, of course, been very, very friendly with Trump and may not be so with Biden, particularly on climate change and the Amazon. And that may be an area of a certain degree of tension and maybe even confrontation. The new Bolivian government, it's hard to say exactly what they want to do, because although it was Evo Morales' party that won the presidential election, President Arce is not necessarily as confrontational as Morales was with the US. And I don't discard at all that once the Biden administration takes office, there can be a real normalization or resumption of full-fledged diplomatic ties between Bolivia and the United States, the exchange of ambassadors, and going back to a normal relationship in which there will be differences, of course. So I don't see any bloc or anti-American coalition emerging. Besides, these governments are too far apart on other issues. López Obrador and Bolsonaro simply don't talk to each other, period. The Argentine president, Alberto Fernandez, has literally no relationship with his neighbor, with Bolsonaro. And they're neighbors. Well, you know that area better than I do, Edward, but it's quite remarkable. They don't even, say hello.
Great. No, thank you so much for that. Professor Schumacher, do you want to add something to that?
Well, I see we have a question that's come in from Paris, from Alan Writing, who's written a book, a very famous book that does the opposite, which looks at Mexico in foreign eyes many years ago. But Alan asked this question: if the Biden administration wishes to bolster democracy and human rights in Latin America, what carrots and sticks should it use?
Well, as always, Alan puts his finger on the more complicated issues and loves to put people in difficult corners. I think it's not easy, but because it depends on the size of the countries and their importance to the United States. But the Biden administration will have carrots and will have sticks. Just to give one example, clearly it's important for the Biden people to go back to the so-called Alliance for Prosperity that Obama tried to set up for the Northern Triangle countries. And that includes El Salvador. They have to do much more. It has to be much more money for more years and more seriousness involved in channeling this money to Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. But El Salvador has a real human rights problem, and Guatemala has a real corruption problem. So does the United States just fork up the money if it's in, even though it's in its interest to do so, to theoretically deter migration, and forget about human rights and democracy in El Salvador and corruption in Guatemala? Or does it find a way of conditioning the two, conditioning the disbursement of funds to these two countries? And Honduras has the same problem at the end of the day, perhaps less radically. Or does it just say, we're going to give you the money, do with it whatever you want, because we want you to stop migrants from coming to the US? I think there you can see that there is a possibility for mixing carrots and sticks on issues that are important to the US, but also on issues that have to be addressed in these countries. Now, ideally, you would do this through, you would include in this sort of stuff, for example, the OAS or the UN. In the case of Guatemala with CICIG, the UN-sponsored anti-corruption commission in Guatemala, you did include the UN. In the case of Honduras, you sort of included the OAS. It didn't really go anywhere. But the Biden people could push strongly for the UN and the OAS and the Inter-American Human Rights Commissions and courts to become linked to the immigration effort and to the money that would be disbursed, invested, donated, whatever you want to call it, to these three countries. Obviously, you know, climate change with Brazil and drug issues with Mexico are another kettle of fish because of the size of the two countries and because of US interest there. But I think it can be done, Alan, if you're listening. And thanks for the question, as always, and thanks for everything.
Alan has another question. I think others have been raising the same issue here too, about on the immigration policy. You know, this is a transition issue, right? If Biden takes follows some of your recommendations on how to handle the migrants coming to the United States, will he have a looming border crisis? Will there be just like a quote unquote flood, for lack of a better word? You know, the large number of immigrants suddenly, once again, you know, the caravans picking up again, and the great numbers trying to come across the border.
Well, I think there is the risk of a surge, particularly if the wrong message is sent, you know, that all of a sudden everybody's welcome. And secondly, if the people smugglers, the polleros or the coyotes, try and take advantage of this to try and get people to go north, telling them, you know, Trump is gone and Biden is going to let everybody in. The pollero at the end of the day doesn't care too much if you get stuck in Ciudad Juarez or in Matamoros for the next year or two, as long as you pay him to get there. If you're in Brownsville or in Matamoros, the pollero doesn't care either way. So they will, that is a real danger, I think, and it has to be addressed. And I'm pretty sure, I'm confident the Biden people are looking at that and will soon begin talking to the Mexicans to find a way to address this challenge. But this is a short-term, real issue, but it's a short-term real issue. The flows are what they are. At the end of the day, you know, these are small countries with relatively small amounts of people who want to come to the United States. With Mexico, you continue to have 200,000 to 300,000 people who leave every year. About a third, maybe even more than a third, come with these temporary visas or other legal forms. So it's not that you're talking about millions and millions and millions of people. You're talking maybe, you know, 1 million, 1.5 million, a couple of million people. This is a country of 330 million inhabitants. I think it's important to get the dimensions of all of this clear to everybody. How many people are going to leave El Salvador to come to the United States? It's a country of 5-6 million inhabitants on over how many years? There is an issue, there's an important question there that Biden has mentioned, which is processing asylum requests in country. It's complicated because if you're fleeing from Mara Salvatrucha or any one of the gangs in San Salvador, and the reason you want to come to the United States is because you think they'll kill you, and you're probably right. If you don't leave, then it doesn't make a lot of sense to go to the U.S. Embassy in San Salvador and wait outside in a line for permission to enter and request asylum, and then go home where they'll kill you. It makes sense on the one hand. Yeah, why don't you just request asylum back home? Well, because if they were going to kill me before I requested asylum, they're going to kill me twice if I request asylum. So it's a complicated issue, granted. But I think, the United States has the resources and the size, and Mexico can help to address what is not an overwhelming problem.
Yeah. Well, another longtime student of Latin America and Fletcher graduate, who was a journalist who lived in Mexico for many years and then worked for the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington, lives in Washington. Jerry Smith has written to ask, is it possible to say whether the United States image in Latin America is better or worse than it was 20 or 30 years ago?
If American, what, excuse me, Edward?
Yes. Is it possible to say whether the United States image in Latin America is better or worse than it was, say, 20 or 30 years ago?
Well, I think, what the polls show, and, I don't think that polls tell the whole story, but the polls show that the U.S. image in Latin America has a lot to do with who's president. The U.S. image was very negative under Bush because of Iraq, not because of anything he did or didn't do in Latin America. It was extraordinary under Obama, and he didn't do a whole lot either. And it's been terrible in most parts of Latin America, perhaps not everywhere, under Trump. So the first thing is, it's a presidential issue because the president of the United States is the most visible image of the United States in places like Latin America, with television, with all sorts of the news, etc. In general terms, my impression is that if you don't formulate it in terms of for or against, but you just look at the growing presence of what I, in my book, call American civilization, following a series of French authors and others, then I think American civilization has reached further into every country in Latin America than ever before. It's not the image only, it's everything that American civilization implies, whether it's music or it's fashion or it's art or it's literature or it's the language or it's technology or it's travel, it's immigration. I mean, in countries like the Northern Triangle ones, or like Ecuador, or like many in the Caribbean, 1 out of every 3 or 4 or 5 locals, so to speak, have family in the United States. And the family is generally happy and sends back nice things to say. There is racism, there's discrimination, there's segregation, of course, yes, but most Honduran immigrants in the United States write or call home. They don't write anymore, they call. They call home and say, how's it going here? It's going okay, it's going well. There's a lot of, self-serving boasting involved. Sure, that's logical, I guess, because you're not going to tell your mother, how's it going? Oh, it's terrible, I shouldn't have left. No, you're going to tell her, hey, it's great. Well, that's understandable. But I think the image is better, but mainly the presence of American civilization, as I say in my book, I think is stronger than ever before.
Well, a senior fellow at the Murrow Center, Miguel Ferrer, who is an expert in digital media, has written to ask, what do you make of AMLO's delay in contacting with President-elect Biden, as so many other world leaders have already done? Is there a sense in Mexico and Latin America that even as Trump leaves the White House, his expected ongoing influence in U.S. affairs requires Mexican and Latin American leaders to treat Trump, deferentially now and in the future?
Well, actually, I wish that López Obrador and Bolsonaro were as sophisticated as Miguel Ferrer is, and that were the reason that they're both not congratulating Biden. But I'm sorry to say, I'm not convinced. I think in the case of López Obrador, first of all, he really wanted Trump to win, and he really thought Trump would win until early Wednesday morning. I'm pretty sure that's the case. And I have people who have told me so in no uncertain terms, first of all. Secondly, I think that he wanted to, sort of be able to use, it's a silly idea, but be able to use his non-congratulating Biden as an argument later to tell Biden, if Biden begins giving him grief on human rights or stuff in Mexico, hey, don't meddle in my affairs. I didn't meddle in yours, don't meddle in mine. I think that had a lot to do with it. And then perhaps there were some delicate negotiations going on between López Obrador and Trump, or their teams, in trying to bring back the Mexican former defense secretary who had been arrested in the US on drug charges and who was sent back by Trump to Mexico in an extraordinary concession by the US for whatever reason it took place. And maybe López Obrador thought, perhaps rightly, that if he did something that Trump didn't like congratulating Biden, Trump would not send his guy back. That is a possible explanation. But I wish Miguel Ferrer was right. But as I said, I'm not convinced.
So following up on that, then, Pururuk Kehar, I hope I pronounced that right, has asked about Bolsonaro. Now, what do you think? Where would Bolsonaro stand after January when Biden takes over the president's estate in the USA?
Well, I mean, he will, first of all, of course, he will not be his honeymoon or love affair with Trump, with the president of the United States, is over. He may continue to be very friendly with Donald Trump, ex-President Donald Trump. He may continue to visit Mar-a-Lago, whether he's sick or not, and infect everybody else around him, as he did, or his team did the last time they went to Mar-a-Lago. But that honeymoon clearly is over, first of all. I think Bolsonaro has said that he will not allow Biden to even bring up the issue of the Amazon. But Biden has also said, particularly in the first debate, if I remember correctly, that he was even willing to consider economic sanctions regarding deforestation and issues affecting climate change in Brazil. And obviously, if the United States rejoins the Paris Agreement on climate change, as Biden said he will, although Brazil is part of it reluctantly under Bolsonaro, he wanted to leave, but was convinced finally not to do so. I think that there's an area there where there can be a very serious kind of confrontation between the United States and Brazil, or between Biden and Bolsonaro, because it is, one of Biden's signature issues. Climate change is one of those issues that he's obviously going to try and get a lot of money for domestically, and try to include as a fundamental part of his foreign policy. I mean, that's why he named a former Secretary of State as climate czar, to handle the foreign policy part. If not, he could have appointed someone, not John Kerry, but appointed a scientist to, be a climate change czar, essentially for domestic purposes. But that's why he has an EPA commissioner. Kerry, that's Kerry's job, and he's going to do it. He's a forceful and energetic guy who knows a lot about this stuff.
I don't want to abuse your time too much, and we've already run over. We left it open to go over a few more minutes. Archie, can I ask one or two more questions that have come in from some of our.
Absolutely. You still have time for about 2 questions. So,
Oh, okay. So this from Mitchell Collins on human rights, going back to that subject, Jorge, if you don't mind, if you can still talk. I mean, I know we're we're really going. You've been so generous with us here.
Oh, not at all, Edward. It's been a privilege.
He says, how does the U.S. work towards a more contextual and capacity building approach to human rights in Latin America when it's grappling with weak national institutions in many of the countries?
Well, one of the first things that the United States can do and hasn't done, except every now and then in one country or another, first of all, is to strengthen human rights organizations in these countries. Most of them have some kind of ombudsman, some kind of national human rights commission. They're more autonomous or less so. They're more active and competent, or stronger or weaker or less so. But there are many ways the United States can strengthen them, whether it be with money, with technical assistance, with international connections. There's many, many ways. A second way, of course, is to strengthen the Inter-American Human Rights Commission and Human Rights Court. The commission is in Washington, the court is in Costa Rica. The United States has not ratified the San Jose 1968 American Convention on Human Rights. That is something that the Biden people should consider. A lot of administrations have not wanted to touch it for different reasons in different cases. But this is now more than 50 years old. It's kind of ridiculous that the United States not ratify something that has governed the human rights situation in Latin America for many, many years. So that's another area by strengthening these institutions. Return, obviously, to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, at the UN in Geneva, and from there push for more rapporteurs, more scrutiny, more involvement in Latin America by the Council in Geneva. There's been a lot, but there's much more that can be done. And finally, by being more serious in its yearly State Department reports on the human rights situation in different countries, because many times the United States has looked the other way on human rights violations in these reports, in the State Department reports, and as recently as a few years ago in the case of Mexico. Obviously, human rights were being violated, but the United States decided to, write somewhat favorably and waive any human rights conditionality because of, national security interests. I can see the logic of doing it sometimes, but I think they've gone too far, and the Biden people can correct that.
Mm-hmm. One last question, sort of going down to the Southern Cone. And we see Chile debating its constitutional model and its constitution, right? We see the changes happening in Bolivia, and then we see the flip-flopping that happens always in Argentina between the Peronists and the non-Peronists, and what exactly their model of government should be. Does the United States have any role in there? Is there anything, do you think, that the Americans can do to help those countries, and it would be good for the people in those countries? What do you think? It's a very vague, broad question. And
I don't know. Chile, I think Biden did the right thing by, if I'm not mistaken, calling the president of Chile before speaking to any other Latin American head of state. And I think that was reasonable, not because I particularly sympathize with Sebastián Piñera, but I think, as I said at some point, he called the president of Chile, not Sebastián Piñera. It was a gesture to Chile, not to Piñera. And I think that was the right thing to do, because Chile is, as always, a country in the vanguard of Latin America. And I think that was a positive step Biden took. I also think that he should not fool around with the constitutional process. It's going to be complicated enough in itself. In the case of Bolivia, I think that, as I said before, they should really seriously work towards a total resumption of diplomatic ties, exchange of ambassadors, etc., on reasonable terms. You can't ask the Bolivians to, accept a huge DEA contingent again, like there were back in the 90s. That's just not going to happen. But I think that, this looks like a very reasonable, sensible government. And I think that there's much to do there. In the case of Argentina, the main issue, the fundamental issue, where the US plays an enormously important role, is to help Argentina with the renegotiation of its debt to the International Monetary Fund. They already settled the stuff with the private banks. I'm not sure they got the best deal they could. I'm not sure it's going to help them a whole lot, but that's done. But now they're in the middle of the negotiation with the IMF. It's a lot of money. And of course, the US continues to be by far the largest shareholder in the IMF and the most important voice. And even though the IMF director she's been very, very constructive and very flexible with the Argentines, if the Biden people push in the right direction and show sympathy for the Argentine situation, I think that would be very helpful. Very, very important, very helpful. It would make a big, big difference.
Well, we've covered so much ground, Jorge. You've been so great. This has been terrifically interesting, and I think so much of what you had to say has indeed been wise, both for the new Biden administration and for all of us and the governments in Latin America. I really, really appreciate this. It's very helpful for us in our own project. I would again recommend to the audience Jorge's book, and there's so much more in there. It really is good. It's good reading, I promise you. It's actually very good reading.
Someone who writes like you do, Edward, that's praise. That's real.
So and so with that, I think we bring the session to an end. Thank you everybody, and thank you, Jorge. All right.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you very much. Miss Lindsay, if you're around, thank you. And thank you everybody for staying with us all this time.
Fantastic. All right. See you. Bye. Goodbye.